for our westernization. We are narrowing the culture gap by westernizing the rest of the world. It helps sometimes, the bond of culture, even if it is imperialistic. The French spend more money than most of their Western friends on French-speaking third world countries. Yeah. They spend more money than most other members of OECD countries on third world societies. What is the bond? The bond is in part French culture. The bond of feeling that it's worth doing this because ultimately it's to the greater glory of France. It's a bond, but it's an imperialistic bond. The Arabs spend a lot of money on each other. It's not an imperialistic bond neatly, but it is a bond that is culturally derived. Some of the Arab countries spend a lot of money on fellow Muslims. It's a culture bond that attempts to translate shared religiosity into a charitable impulse. So the closing the culture gap has possibilities, but it's a slow process and it carries the danger of imperialism. Closing the ideological gap, well, sometimes you wish just the West itself would move in the same direction at the same time. It would help. Yeah? For example, I wish we didn't have a situation where France moves to the left and shortly afterwards Germany moves to the right. That the Federal Republic of Germany moves to the right, France moves to the left, the United States moves to the right, Greece moves to the left, Sweden moves to the left, the United Kingdom moves to the right. You are talking about the West itself, but the West itself self-paralyzes, is engaged in self-paralysis on global issues because ideologically it doesn't move in step. The vagaries of Western electoral behavior. So that when you think at last I've got a more responsive France, you have got a less responsive Germany. And so closing the ideological gap may need closure even within the North itself and within the Northwest, as well as closure of gaps between North and South. As for closing the gap of international class interests, I personally feel that the West especially won't deliver when Western economies are internally healthy. The West is more likely to deliver when Western economies are externally vulnerable. It is not true that if the United States economy fully recovers, the United States will become charitable, because it has had its heyday of health and it didn't lead to fundamental transformation of society. So it is not internal health, but external vulnerability that might induce greater readiness to accommodate the third world. But finally, it is in fact the gap between the have and the have-nots that has to be closed. That is the center of the debate. Some of my compatriots, some of fellow African intellectuals say, let us disengage a curse and a plague on both their houses, the East and the West, in the Northern Hemisphere. I tend to disagree. I tend to disagree because I think the North has the capacity to destroy a planet that is as much ours in the South as anybody else's. The North has the capacity to destroy the planet, firstly, by simply recklessly depleting its resources. Or it can destroy the planet by a reckless damage to the ecology. Or it can destroy that planet by a nuclear war that is in the first instance north-north, but which has consequences for the South. It's too late to pull out of the game. Because of this destructive power that the North has, we cannot afford to let them be, even if we insist on their letting us be. And the price for our moderating some influence on them may be a continuing interaction with them. It's past the hour of disengagement from the global system. The only alternative is working out a viable and more equitable level of mutual dependence. And within the requirements of that mutual dependence is the simple imperative that the gap between the haves and the have-nots must be narrowed, even if we have to struggle very hard to narrow the other 5 gaps beforehand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Mazrui will answer a few questions now.
And deal with any challenges as well. Yes.
Yes, well, first of all, I would question seriously the assumption that you made that because the assumption that women are not institutional in charity, because historically women have not played a role in the administration of those institutions which have had the responsibility for distributing considerable financial resources. And secondly, I just wonder if you've considered that perhaps, I do agree, that women in many cultures, North American culture included, have experienced and continue to experience the brunt of economic insecurity, above all in their family situations. However, I wonder if you considered that perhaps through experiencing that insecurity, that perhaps in that lies the root of a greater potential for empathy with other women who are also facing that same insecurity, although it may be in very different circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is difficult to disengage any assumption of a cultural tendency for women to be. Oh, I'm sorry. The question really was challenging my claim that women are institutionally and, in my terms, materially less charitable in impersonal relations than men were. And the questioner went on to argue that first, women had less control over some of these institutions that engaged in transfer of resources to needier sectors of the world. But she also added that women, precisely because of their own sense of insecurity with regard to the future, might be expected to sympathize more with other women. Though my claim was not so much inter-women sympathy, yeah? So it may be that women against women, there may be a certain area of solidarity in certain circumstances. And it might be, if you're identifying with other women as women, then you are beginning to personalize it in a special sense, and maybe to some extent compatible with what I was saying. But I agree with the notion that women are less in control of the instrumentalities which deal with transfer of capital or resources on charitable grounds. But I think you will find that when you've explained all the differences in areas of control, there is the residual element of family possessiveness that's probably more developed than it is among men, and may be a direct result of their insecurity. Now, in third world studies, there's certainly a good deal of evidence of women disapproving about men engaging in idealistic causes that involve money, that are impersonal, and they think of men as kind of intellectual enthusiasts endangering the family income for ends which were dubious. And I'm sure that it's not limited to the third world, this kind of hard-headedness about resources that women have. But how you separate that from differences in ownership and control, I'm not absolutely sure, because arguments about causation are bedeviled by precisely the multiplicity of factors.
My main question is about one important thing which you have said, that is, we in the third world, we can't, it is true, it is not the hour of disengagement.
Mm.
And previously, you also said that the only way to make the law to accept or reduce the gap which is existing nowadays is to make them vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I would like you to see how you can bring these two contradictions or controversies together.
Mm.
The idea that we put a form to make them vulnerable, and how we cannot disengage in the other way. I think that these things are actually interconnected, despite the fact that we give the example of OPEC.
Yeah.
But the OPEC is another way around. If you look scientifically into what the OPEC done, it has done good for the North rather than to the third world countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like you to see how far this goes on
Mm.
really a shift.
Yeah. Well, with regard to northern economies, how to make them more vulnerable, but that is in this case more vulnerable to southern pressures, to southern pressures. So they must be capable of being made to respond. I think the trouble with OPEC is it didn't have adequate plan for inducing fundamental change in the world system. The members did show some sympathy with other third world countries, but there wasn't enough of a readiness to use the available resource of oil to force northern countries to accept change, not just in energy, but in other spheres of life. I was myself worried at one time that the North might begin to economize in the consumption of oil prematurely. My own position has been that a successful premature program of northern self-reliance in oil is very bad news for the third world as a whole. So all the efforts that the North were engaged in saving energy was in the short run detrimental to the cause of changing the world system. Why? Because the more self-reliant the North became in oil, the less responsive it was likely to be to pressures for major changes in the world system. So in reality, the North didn't really economize in oil. It just happened Northern economies begin to enter into a recession, use of energy declined, the oil glut ensued, and the power of OPEC was reduced. So the moment was missed to some extent by OPEC, though not lost completely. So in spite of your reservations, some of which I share about the role of OPEC in North-South relations, I think it still stands the chance of becoming an effective instrument for exploiting northern vulnerability. Yes? Yes?
My question has to do with what you said on the imbalance in communication.
Yeah.
With special reference to the example you gave about Uganda.
Yeah.
Don't you think it's unfair for us as Africans to blame the Europeans or the West for the lack of inter-African communication? you know, that in a sense we are using them as a scapegoat.
Mm.
And that kind of attitude
Mm.
prevents us from taking positive steps to redress the imbalance. In a sense, for Kenyan newspapers to have reporters in Uganda, that is, you know, in a sense, it prevents them from having viable reporters in Uganda from whom they could get the correct information rather than on relying on British newspapers.
Mhm.
I don't know what
Yes, yes, sure. Well, in a way, I wasn't so much blaming Northerners. I was blaming the global condition, if you like, that the situation which left us with such inequities. It's true that in Uganda, Kenya should have had its reporters on Makerere Hill. But on the other hand, it's impossible for Kenya to have reporters all over the place. I'll wait till you finish, because I'm answering you. Oh, it's literally impossible for African newspapers to have correspondence in different parts of the world, the way major American newspapers or agencies may have. Sometimes the New York Times may have just one person in Nairobi that covers 5 countries, yeah, and then submits reports every so often. But I cannot see either the Standard or the Nation in Kenya having that many number of foreign correspondents in different parts of the world to feed it. Yeah. Now, the New York Times and whatnot doesn't have every part of the world covered directly by its own correspondents. It has, in addition, to use the northern news agencies. Until now, we haven't had the equivalent of southern news agencies. But you have the beginnings of an effort. I think there is a meeting coming up in North Africa right now, the kind of news agency of non-aligned countries that is going to make an effort in that direction. So I agree with you if you were just blaming David Martin of The Observer, it's unfair. I don't agree with you if we are blaming the total global inequalities that exist at the moment. Because unless you criticize them and demand change, you will accept them. And they are unjust, even if they are blind. Yes, madam?
My question goes back to what my lady observer mentioned here
Yeah.
about the position of women and the part she plays in the distributions and the whatever global thing.
Right.
Now, my observation is that in both developed countries and in developing countries,
Right.
the position of a woman is kind of defined by stereotypes. And in both cases, even when the woman tries to be involved in distribution or in production or in whatever field, I see the man in both developed and developing countries kind of being a little bit shaken. And the man constantly tries to place the woman where he thinks she should be. We have, as you have already mentioned, quite a number of women who have the potential to contribute, who have the potential to do certain things, but often, the men place them where they feel they belong. So how do you come up with those points that, the point you outlined that the woman feels insecure? Why is the male, folk who try to place the woman where I think she belongs?
Mm-hmm. I agree with much of that. At the same point, I said they are being out of the instruments of coercion. Getting out of the instruments of coercion is in my opinion, the primary reason why women are underprivileged politically, economically, and socially. That to have either shoved out or moved out of the game of ultimate power is the decisive reason. Now, I know it's not a Marxist position, it's not an economic determinist position. The economic determinist position would be that where women have comparable economic power, they ought to be well on their way to comparable political and other power. I say this doesn't hold up even remotely in the world. There are immense differences in women's economic power, immense differences from one society to another. But those differences are not commensurate with differences in other forms of power. In every society I know of, women are still extensively subordinate. They are extensively subjugated, as you rightly put, regardless of whether they own 40% of the national wealth of the United States or they own almost nothing in a particular community in West Africa. Yeah? Regardless of that differences, the net result is the same. So then you look for an explanation. And my position, which is where I'm fanatical, forget it. It is not an economic reason. It is not a reason of reduced female participation in economic productivity. Women in Africa are immensely productive economically. In some African societies, much more productive than the men. They work harder than the men in some of those. Does it make a difference to their power? Nothing. So until the women enter the game of power and coercion, they will be at the same disadvantage. It is a pessimistic interpretation of the human condition, but it's the only explanation that can take into account all these economic differentiations from society to society, which make no difference to the power of women to control their destiny.
But how do they enter when even in a society like this one, where the woman is supposed to be liberated, I still find that the woman still experiences a lot of discrimination in jobs, where I find the woman still experiences, discrimination in promotions, and where I find, for example, contrary to what I used to think before I came here, that the woman in this country doesn't do a lot of household chores. She still works, and at the same time when she goes home, she carries the heaviest burden of the housework. So how do you see this situation ever changing even a little bit?
Well, in this society, there are second level explanation. For example, I don't think women in the West have adequately exploited even the electoral power they have. Yeah. So one is you struggle and you get the franchise for women. Are women organized enough to make the most of the voting power they have? There are just the beginnings of the signs of organization now in this society. So even the powers they do have, they have underexploited them, partly for long-term cultural reasons. So if you have 50% of the voting power of the United States and only a fraction of women in Congress, and if the idea of having women as presidential candidates still seems relatively remote, although other countries, like the ones I mentioned, have already had women heads of states, then there are additional reasons in this society, peculiar to American society, that haven't as yet accommodated themselves to the full entry of women into the power structure. Yeah. But when you say the men forced women into that, in this country, I think the women could make a difference. So there is a partial abdication by women, just as I believe there is a partial abdication by blacks in this country, because the society is not fully open, but it's opened enough to allow for considerable organization by women and considerable organization by blacks. So both blacks and women have underexploited the power that the system already gives them at the moment. This doesn't apply to many African countries which may not permit women the same range of alternative. But in this country, you can't blame it all on men. It's partly an abdication by women themselves. Right at the back there.
As much as I agree with you on the issue that the South cannot disengage with the North, I think there's certain areas where the South has made clear that the North has to leave it alone. For example, we don't have agents in this country's time. We don't have agents in Europe's time. We have people in CIA, KGB, whatever, in foreign government, doing this and that. If you allow them just to come in and do this type of thing, you don't have any government that's stable. All the people coming determining the government in those countries. I want to comment about that. Second thing I want you to comment about, you talk about the blue sky. And there's been an attempt to organize the collection and dissemination of news from third nations and both in the UNESCO. Do you think this is a good idea for regional, say you talk about the nation in Nairobi and Western, they can't collect information adequately. Do you think there's a way Africans could organize so that there's a nation, an African method of collecting and disseminating information?
Well, with regard to your first question, it's true that third world countries don't have a capacity for extensive worldwide international espionage. That's why I hope my American friends here will forgive me, but I really was elated, absolutely delighted when South Koreans gave Americans a taste of their own medicine. South Korean secret intelligence went around corrupting the American political establishment. And it was really very good. It's a kind of golden rule in reverse. Do not do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. So we don't have that capacity. But that's not a reason for disengaging from the North. I think it makes sense to try and reduce the power of the North over us. What I've been trying to say is that we should really explore ways of increasing our influence on the North simultaneously. Yeah, as we try to reduce their power on the South should look for instruments of leverage on Northern policy making, and that it is fundamental to the survival of the planet that we should have a say in its fate, and we cannot have a say in its fate unless we grope for these ways of exerting leverage on the northern system. My friend Victor here knows my views. I said, even those third world professors that go around giving talks at American campuses, they are part of the effort. They are part of the effort of attempting to penetrate or counter-penetrate northern citadels of opinion, so that you get an input into the process that initially may be no more than influence one undergraduate in this audience. And if I'm lucky, that undergraduate may become a state senator and may already be more sensitized to some of these issues than he might have been before. That's my strategy of counter-penetration, to reinforce whatever liberation we may ourselves accomplish. With regard to your second question, whether we should have kind of news agencies, African news agencies, yes, I think really these efforts should be made. They need more technical expertise than we at the moment possess, but we should try them out anyhow. And in some cases, they need more political freedom for the journalists than some of our governments permit them. So it's no good having an African news agency that has only government bulletins of the latest positions. That we should grope for an Africa that permits greater journalistic independence, so that these boys and girls who are collecting news and information can transmit to the rest of Africa and to the rest of the world their attempts at the truth, rather than the government's approximation of the truth. So it's a major responsibility, but we should try it out. And we are moving in that direction. Yes?
I agree with your assertion that military buildup is mainly due to a masculine, macho type of thinking. And I think that besides incorporating more women into military decisions, we also need to drastically change the way that the men in power are thinking right now. And do you agree that in order to stop the global arms buildup right now, the men in power must revert to an attitude of more of a peaceful type fellowship rather than always an attitude of number one, look out for yourself?
Yeah. No, the question is part about whether there's too much of a militaristic posture among the men that are in power, and secondly, whether we can in fact change the system without first changing the men that are already there, right? That are already there. For those societies where women do stand a chance to organize for greater integration into the full power structure, and I mean the full power structure, including the military, and I emphasize that emphatically. And this country is among those countries where the women could attempt to do that. They should do it. Just waiting for the men to have a change of heart, either on militarism or on integrating the women, is futile. I think it's unlikely to happen unless there's considerable pressure by women. So the same momentum that gave the suffragettes impetus towards getting the vote for women may be needed. That is not enough to get women into the booth, voting booth. It's imperative that they be in the barracks and they be participants in deciding between war and peace. So while I agree with your frustrations with the regimes as they exist now and their military postures, I think waiting for them to change before we attempt to androgynize the power structure would be a mistake. Yes.
If you had the power to reallocate resources, what would be some of the things you would do in practical terms to change the condition? I'm talking about reallocating resources to the north and south.
And I would be president of a northern country, is that it?
Well, you could be a czar.
as Tsar of the northern hemisphere. Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, as you can imagine, the trouble with that type of scenario, you would then assume, okay, supposing I was in power in the north, and giving me that and I'm a southerner, how would I then redistribute the resources? Of course, my inclination would be to engage in a massive transfer of resources southwards. Then the question would be, what criteria of distribution would you invoke in that transfer? There is one, the minimalist end. The minimalist end is you transfer the money to where people are in dire hardship and couldn't in any case have a viable human existence without external aid. In this case, we are dealing with the poorest of the poor. So one yardstick is the charitable factor. The charitable factor. Transfer resources to the people of Bangladesh or to the people of the Sahel who are near starvation. The second level of criterion, transfer resources to economies that are on the verge of making a breakthrough. Third world economies that are on the verge of a breaking through, which seem to need a specific type of injection to make them cross the borderline between indigence and the beginnings of prosperity. Thirdly, transfer attention, not resources, transfer attention into restructuring the rules of trade, the nature of the monetary system in the world. There are countries now which can't import food, not because it doesn't exist, because we have locked ourselves into a monetary system which says you must have this type of money before you can buy in, you can buy food. We have invented for ourselves a special monetary system of exchange which incapacitates a Tanzania from buying specific food for itself. So in this case, it isn't so much transfer of resources, although some resources would be needed. It's just a new attention to modifying rules of trade, international monetary patterns of behavior, directions of investment, not just aid, directions of investment to areas which could transform regions. And then after my third day of work as Tsar, I will hold a party. Yeah, shall we take? Pardon? Yes, and you are invited. Yes, sir.
What would you do about the lack of distribution of wealth in those third world countries ready to make a breakthrough? Because are there any good examples of even a good distribution of wealth that you could even point to?
No, you're quite right that internal distribution in those societies is another headache to attend to, though it's also a problem in the northern hemisphere. How you deal with transfers across societies is one problem. Whether you can have transfers within societies that are adequately egalitarian without controlling those societies is a problem not just for the South, but for the United States, for the Soviet Union. Even those countries that are socialist have disparities of advantage and allocations. Now, we may have to have another Tsar for that particular headache. And, unless one is genuinely converted to worldwide socialism that attempts considerable redistribution within societies. That's certainly one answer. At the moment, the cases of socialism we have included substantial centralized control. And it may be that narrowing the ideological gap that way may have costs as well as benefits. But I'd rather deal first with the distribution across societies and hope that within societies there will be forces that will generate internal reforms.
You can see how incurable it is in this country.
Oh yeah, the forces within societies, yeah, but if you delegate the worry about changes within societies to the people within those societies, then at least you satisfy one moral imperative, some degree of self-determination to the different societies about their internal arrangements. So you take the global pool of resources and say, this is owned by humankind to some extent, and then you redistribute it accordingly, but then you permit the different societies to find formulae of internal distribution themselves. Last one, right at the back.
Yeah, concerning the issue of ideology which you talked about.
Yeah.
Now, if in fact there ought to be a reduction in the gap between ideology and North-South ideology,
Yeah.
taken for granted that the North itself is not in step as far as ideology is concerned, are you suggesting that there should be some kind of a world ideology where both the North and the South adhere to? And if so, which kind of ideology would you suggest?
Yeah, there is a type of ideological prison house that we do have components of an ideology that is global at the moment and is translated into structures. Unfortunately, it may not be what we want. Yeah. And that ideology consists of two factors. One, the nation-state system that we seem to have inherited from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, so that every segment now of humankind is organized into something called the state, and then participates in a global system of interaction, where these balls of interaction are in fact the different states operating, with areas of jurisdiction and sovereignty, which include the right to persecute your own people, the right to accumulate enormous military advantage, etc., etc. So that's part of a global. There is almost no exception. Every human being now is subject to that aspect of of structure called the state, which is itself an outgrowth of a particular way of viewing the world. Secondly is capitalism. That again is global. There is no exception. There is no exception in the Soviet Union or in Poland or in Mozambique. What do I mean by that? I mean the system internationally of dealing with each other as states is based on market forces that go up and down, just as in the capitalist society within. The world system is a market system. Secondly, the major currencies of international exchange are overwhelmingly currencies of the leading capitalist countries. That's what we mean when we say foreign exchange. You mean, do you have dollars, Deutschmarks, Japanese yens, etc. Yeah. Thirdly, the major financial institutions of the world, the banks, both developmental and commercial, are derived from Western countries and lend billions of dollars to both socialist countries and third world countries. Mexico is nearly broke and just been granted a $4.5 billion loan from the World Bank. Poland is in dire need of money from the West to pay the West. So is Romania. Cuba has enormous debts. Tanzania, they all have debts within a system that was born out of a particular way of economic arrangement. Yeah. So now then, if that's a bad ideology, is there a new one we can grope for? Well, one is to begin to moderate this level of control by the state system on one side and by the capitalist system on the other. Secondly is to narrow the differences between the sectional ideologies, what is called a theory of convergence, so that Western societies become more and more collectivist, more and more welfare state, more and more concerned about workers, etc. And you hope socialist countries become more and more liberal, that they should have permitted solidarity organization to re-emerge as a factor in Polish life. They should have allowed Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia to move towards human rights. So on one side, you have socialist countries getting more liberal and liberal countries getting more socialist. That's the alternative approach of convergence as the gap narrows, because the distance in normative terms is getting to be shorter.
First of all, as you accepted, okay, why should it be capitalism if in the first place a country like France has experimented with capitalism, I don't know for how long, they found that it wasn't what they wanted, so they changed socialism. Greece is the same thing, Spain the same thing. Now, why should it be capitalism? And second, for the third world countries, isn't that ruling out any kind of originality? I mean, why must it be socialism or capitalism? I mean, why can the third world countries come up with their own, or rather apply the traditional, if you may allow that, traditional way of life, whatever it is, which has been there for the past 100 years or how long it's been, and then come up with something which is not necessarily capitalism or socialism. Why must it be capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is absolutely my last answer. Now, first of all, I'm in sympathy with all efforts in third world countries to find their own paths of development. I'm in absolute sympathy, and I think we are unnecessarily locked into this dichotomous paradigm of either socialism domestically or capitalism domestically. Our options may be wider than that. But in a way, you misunderstood me. Maybe I was talking at two levels and I hadn't clarified myself. Of course, a country can go socialist internally. So did the Soviet Union, France in a more limited extent, Marxist, Ethiopia, Mozambique. I'm saying, although those individual countries have gone socialist in their domestic internal arrangements, they are living in a world and operating in a world which is subject to capitalist rules. So when you as